The world was burning with war. Not just small fights, but huge global conflicts that tore countries apart. In this time of chaos and death, a darkness grew in a distant land. It was the 1930s and 1940s, a period when the Empire of Japan was expanding its power, moving into China. And deep within occupied China, in a quiet, seemingly innocent rural area near a town called Pingfang, a monstrous secret was being built, brick by chilling brick. This secret place was a research facility, a large, sprawling complex. It was known simply as Unit 731. This was not a normal army base, and it was certainly not a normal hospital. It was a factory of pure evil, a laboratory where humanity died. The mastermind behind this unspeakable place was a man named Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. He was a doctor, a man who had studied microbiology, the science of tiny living things like bacteria and viruses. But instead of using his knowledge to heal, he twisted it to destroy. Ishii was driven by a cold, relentless ambition. He believed that the next great war would be fought not with guns and bombs alone, but with germs. He wanted Japan to have the most powerful biological weapons in the world. He wanted to create diseases that could wipe out entire populations, more effectively and silently than any bomb. He believed that if Japan could perfect germ warfare, it would be unbeatable. This dark vision led to the creation of Unit 731. The very first step for Ishii and his team was to get their test subjects. They needed living bodies. And where did these bodies come from? They came from the shadows of war. People arrested by the Japanese army, often Chinese civilians, soldiers, anti-Japanese fighters, and even criminals, were sent to Unit 731. They were political prisoners, innocent people swept up in the brutal conflict, and sometimes even people from Korea, Mongolia, and Russia. Once they arrived at Unit 731, they lost everything. Their names, their identities, their rights. They were stripped of their humanity. The Japanese doctors and guards called them logs or maruda. It means pieces of wood. They were just objects, disposable items for cruel experiments. This dehumanization was the first, most chilling step in their torture. If you are just a log, then anything can be done to you. Imagine being one of these people. One day you are living your life, perhaps fighting for your freedom or simply trying to survive under occupation. The next, you are seized, blindfolded, and thrown into a train car. You travel for days, packed tightly with other terrified souls. You arrive at a large, grim compound. You are pushed out, your clothes taken, your head shaved. You are given a number. Your name is gone. Your family, your past, your future, all gone. You are in Unit 731, and the fear, a cold, constant knot in your stomach, never leaves. You know that death is coming, but you don't know how or when, or what unspeakable horrors you will face before it arrives. Every minute is a waiting game of terror. The facility itself was vast. It had high walls, guard towers, and barbed wire. Inside, there were many buildings: barracks for the Japanese staff, research laboratories, dissection rooms, animal houses for breeding rats and fleas which carried plague, and most importantly, prisons. These were not like normal prisons. They were designed to hold people for scientific experimentation, not for justice. The cells were small, cold, and often without proper light or sanitation. The prisoners were usually held alone or in very small groups, always under strict guard. They were weak from hunger, constantly beaten, and their bodies were already suffering before the real experiments even began. The main purpose of Unit 731 was germ warfare. Ishii wanted to create the perfect disease weapon. To do this, he needed to understand diseases in a way no one else did. And the way he chose to understand them was by infecting living people. They would take prisoners and deliberately infect them with the most deadly diseases known to man. They used cholera, which causes terrible diarrhea and dehydration, making the body waste away. They use typhoid, which brings high fevers, weakness, and internal bleeding. They used anthrax, a terrifying disease that can cause painful skin sores or attack the lungs, making breathing impossible. But perhaps the most feared was plague, carried by fleas and rats, a disease that caused black swellings on the body and killed quickly and painfully. The methods of infection were varied and cruel. Some prisoners were forced to eat food that was mixed with plague bacteria or drink water contaminated with cholera. Imagine swallowing something, knowing it will soon bring a terrible sickness and a slow, agonizing death. Other times, they would infect people by injection, pushing deadly germs directly into their veins. They wanted to see how the disease started, how it spread, and how quickly it killed without any medicine or treatment. They were watching coldly. One of the most chilling experiments involving plague was conducted outdoors. Prisoners would be taken from their cells, often weak and trembling, and tied to wooden stakes in a large, open field. Above them, Japanese planes would fly over, dropping ceramic bombs. These were not explosive bombs, but bombs filled with plague-infected fleas and rats. The bombs would shatter on the ground, releasing thousands of tiny, biting fleas. The doctors and scientists, wearing masks and protective gear, would watch from a safe distance. They observed how quickly the fleas would bite the tied-up prisoners. They wanted to see how long it took for the disease to show its first terrible symptoms. They wanted to know if this was a good way to spread plague in enemy cities. Imagine being tied to a stake, knowing you are a target, feeling tiny bites, and understanding that each bite might be bringing a horrible death. The air itself became a weapon. The suffering was extreme. The infected prisoners would endure terrible fevers, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. They would suffer from extreme nausea, vomiting everything they tried to keep down. Their stomachs would cramp with agonizing pain, leading to constant bloody diarrhea. Their bodies would become covered in painful sores or dark swellings. They would struggle for breath, their lungs filling with fluid. Every cough, every gasp, every scream was carefully recorded by the Japanese doctors. They did not offer comfort. They did not offer medicine. They simply observed, detached and cold, the slow, agonizing death of their human logs. Each death was a successful experiment, giving them more data for their evil plans. Another terrifying area of research at Unit 731 involved frostbite. This was especially brutal during the harsh winters in Pingfang, where temperatures would drop far below freezing. Prisoners would be taken from their unheated cells, often dressed in thin clothes, and forced outside into the bitter cold. They would be tied up, sometimes to posts, with their arms and legs exposed to the icy winds and snow. Japanese doctors, dressed warmly in thick coats, would pour cold water over the prisoners' limbs. They wanted to see how quickly the flesh would freeze. They wanted to study how frostbite developed. Imagine your skin slowly losing all feeling, turning white, then waxy yellow, and finally a terrifying black. The pain would be intense at first, a deep ache, then a burning sensation, and then a horrible numbness as the nerves died. The doctors would often hit the frozen limbs with wooden sticks or hammers. They listened to the sound, a dull thud or a sharp crack, to tell how deeply the tissue was frozen. They wanted to know which parts of the body froze fastest and how different levels of cold affected the flesh. Then came the thawing experiments. They wanted to find the best way to treat frostbite for their own soldiers. So, they would try different methods to warm the frozen limbs. Some prisoners would have their frozen arms or legs plunged into hot water, some into cold water. Some were put near a fire, others were simply left to thaw slowly. When the frozen flesh began to thaw, the pain would return, even worse than before. It was an unspeakable agony as the blood rushed back into damaged, dying tissue. The skin would blister, then peel away. Muscles would swell, turn purple, and then rot. Many times gangrene would set in, meaning the flesh would decay and become infected. The limbs would turn black and putrid. When gangrene was severe, the doctors would perform amputations. They would cut off the dying arms or legs, often without proper anesthesia or care, just to see the effects on the body. The prisoners would scream in pure agony, their cries echoing through the cold, sterile laboratories. But their pain was just part of the experiment. They were treated as if they were not alive, as if they were just frozen meat to be studied. Many prisoners lost their limbs, only to be used in other experiments later, their bodies constantly being destroyed piece by piece. The long, drawn-out suffering of these frostbite victims was truly horrifying, a testament to the extreme cruelty committed in the name of science. The scientists at Unit 730 believed that understanding these extreme limits of human endurance and the effects of disease and cold would make Japan a superpower. They were blinded by their ambition and their twisted sense of duty. They saw their victims not as people with families, dreams, and fears, but as disposable research material for a cold, ruthless goal. This dehumanization was the bedrock of their atrocities. Every day was a new torture, a new terror, a new form of agonizing death for the logs in Unit 731. The constant fear of being chosen for the next unspeakable experiment hung over every prisoner, a dark cloud that promised a painful, lonely end. This was only the beginning of the horrors that unfolded within the secret walls of Unit 731. The horrors inside Unit 731 were not limited to germ warfare and frostbite, though these were terrifying enough. The minds behind this evil place, driven by a cold, calculating desire for scientific knowledge at any cost, pushed the boundaries of human cruelty to its absolute limit. They explored every possible way to cause pain, disease, and death, all in the name of military advantage. One of the most ghastly practices they performed was vivisection. This word means cutting open a living body. Doctors at Unit 730 would perform surgery on prisoners while they were still alive, and often without any anesthetic, or just a very weak one that did not truly numb the pain. Why did they do this? They believed that if a person was dead, their body would change, and the organs would not be in their natural working state. They wanted to see organs functioning, blood flowing, muscles moving, and systems interacting in a living human being. Imagine the unspeakable horror of feeling the cold blade cut into your flesh, seeing your own insides, hearing the cold, professional voices of the doctors, knowing you are alive but being treated like an animal on a dissection table. The prisoners would scream, their bodies writhing in agony, but their screams were met with cold indifference. To these doctors, the logs were not human. They were just material, living laboratories for their twisted curiosity. They would perform many types of vivisections. They might cut open a man's stomach and intestines to see how his digestion worked, then watch him slowly bleed to death. They would remove organs like the liver, lungs, or brain just to study them. They would dissect pregnant women, still alive, to observe the fetus inside. They would cut open a person's chest to see the heart beating. Every incision, every gasp of pain, every gurgle of blood was carefully observed, documented, and timed. The goal was never to save a life, but to understand death, to learn how to inflict it more effectively. The mental and physical torment of these procedures defies description. The image of a person, fully aware, being cut open and taken apart piece by piece, is perhaps the ultimate symbol of Unit 731's depravity. Beyond vivisection, they conducted experiments on various human systems. They would investigate the effects of starvation and dehydration, Prisoners would be deliberately deprived of all food and water for many days, sometimes weeks. The doctors would watch them slowly waste away, their bodies shrinking, their skin tightening over their bones, their eyes sinking into hollow sockets. They wanted to see how long a human body could survive without nourishment. They wanted to observe the exact progression of organ failure, the agonizing effects of extreme thirst and hunger. When the prisoners finally died, their emaciated bodies would be immediately cut open for an autopsy to see what starvation had done to their internal organs. The constant, gnawing pain of hunger, the unbearable dryness of thirst, and the terror of knowing you were slowly dying for no reason other than a scientific record was a slow, agonizing form of torture. They also experimented with pressure chambers. These were large, strong metal rooms where they could change the air pressure inside. They would put prisoners in these chambers and slowly lower the atmospheric pressure, making it feel like they were going higher and higher into the sky, even though they were on the ground. As the pressure dropped, the air inside a person's body, in their lungs, stomach, and intestines, would expand rapidly. This caused unimaginable internal pain. The prisoners' eyeballs would pop out of their sockets due to the pressure. Their eardrums would burst. Blood would stream from their mouths and noses as their internal organs were ripped apart. The Japanese doctors would watch, cold and detached, as the people convulsed and their bodies exploded from the inside, often dying in a burst of blood and ruptured organs. They wanted to know the exact pressure at which a human body would fail, data they thought useful for high-altitude bombing. Other chilling experiments involved gas exposure. Prisoners were locked in sealed chambers, and various poisonous gases were released inside. Doctors would observe through windows, watching the horrific effects of the gas on the human body. They wanted to know which gases were most lethal, how quickly they killed, and what physical signs appeared as the person died from suffocation or poisoning. The terror of being trapped in a small space, breathing in a burning, suffocating gas, seeing your body lose control, gasping for air that would never come, was a nightmare that lasted until death. The scope of Unit 731's evil was enormous. It was not just a few doctors doing these things. It was a vast organization. Thousands of people worked there: doctors, scientists, nurses, guards, administrators. They built large prison blocks, operating theaters, laboratories filled with equipment, specialized chambers, and even a large incinerator to burn the bodies, destroying the evidence of their monstrous acts. They bred millions of rats and fleas in giant incubators, deliberately infecting them with plague and other diseases to be used in experiments. This was an industrial-scale operation of death and human exploitation. The daily life of a prisoner inside Unit 731 was a constant, living nightmare. Every morning, there was the terrifying uncertainty of who would be chosen for the next experiment. There was no routine, only the grim knowledge that your number could be called at any moment. Prisoners were kept in terrible conditions, cold, hungry, dirty, and often sick. They were beaten by the guards for no reason, starved, and humiliated. They were never given any hope of release. They knew their fate was sealed. They would die here for science. The psychological torture of this absolute hopelessness was as brutal as the physical pain. They listened to the screams of others, knowing their turn was coming. They watched their friends disappear, never to be seen again. They lived in a world where humanity had been completely stripped away. The extreme dehumanization was key to the operation. The Japanese staff were taught to see the prisoners as subhuman, as mere animals or logs. This allowed them to commit acts that would otherwise be impossible for a normal person. They were indoctrinated with the idea that their work was vital for the Japanese Empire, a sacrifice for the nation's glory. This twisted patriotism, combined with scientific curiosity and racism, created a chilling environment where morality simply ceased to exist. The prisoners had no names, only numbers. They had no rights, only functions in an experiment. They were expendable. As World War II began to turn against Japan, the leaders of Unit 731 became frantic. They accelerated their experiments, trying to gather as much data as possible before their defeat. They planned massive biological attacks against enemy cities, including the United States, but these plans were never fully carried out, partly due to the war's end and partly due to technical difficulties. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the Japanese Military High Command issued a chilling order to Unit 731: destroy all evidence. The facility was systematically demolished. Buildings were blown up, laboratories were burned, records were shredded and incinerated, and most brutally, any remaining living prisoners were murdered. The last logs were killed to ensure no witnesses could tell their terrible stories. Some were shot, some were poisoned, others were simply left to die in the exploding buildings. The Japanese staff, including Lieutenant General Ishii, were ordered to remain silent, to never speak of what they had done. They were told to scatter, to blend back into society. But the truth, like a persistent ghost, could not be entirely buried. Some former Unit 731 personnel later spoke out, haunted by what they had witnessed or participated in. Some prisoners, miraculously, managed to escape or were freed in the chaos of war's end. Their fragmented stories, often full of unbearable details, slowly began to emerge, piecing together the horrifying truth. What happened next was perhaps as shocking as the experiments themselves. After the war, the American government, specifically the United States military, made a terrible and deeply immoral deal with the leaders of Unit 731, including Lieutenant General Ishii. Instead of prosecuting them for their horrific war crimes, instead of putting them on trial for their mass murder and human torture, the Americans offered them immunity. They let them go free. Why? Because these doctors had invaluable data. They had learned firsthand about the effects of germ warfare on humans, about extreme cold, about vivisection, about human endurance. This was knowledge the Americans desperately wanted for their own Cold War biological weapons programs. So, the monsters of Unit 731, the men who had committed unspeakable atrocities, were never punished. They were never brought to justice. Many of them went on to live normal lives in Japan, some even becoming respected doctors and scientists, continuing their careers as if nothing had ever happened. They built hospitals, ran clinics, and taught in universities, their hands clean of visible blood, but stained forever by the lives they had destroyed. The victims of Unit 731, those thousands upon thousands of innocent men, women, and children, never received justice. Their screams were silenced, their bodies incinerated, their stories often unknown to the wider world. Their suffering remains a dark, unaddressed wound in history. The legacy of Unit 731 is not just about the numbers of dead, but about the profound betrayal of humanity. It shows what happens when science is twisted into a tool for evil, when human life is deemed worthless for a higher purpose, and when racial hatred fuels unimaginable cruelty. It stands as a chilling reminder that the greatest horrors are often not fantasy, but real events perpetrated by real people, hiding behind the veneer of medical research and wartime necessity. The echoes of the agony within those hidden labs still reverberate, a constant, horrifying warning that we must never forget this abyss of human cruelty, and we must always seek justice for those who suffer in silence. The story of Unit 731 is a testament to the darkest depths humanity can reach, a true horror that must be remembered so that it is never, ever repeated.